Welcome to you all to this first webinar that we're hosting the California Wheat Commission. My name is Claudia Cutter. I'm the Executive Director of the California Wheat Commission. And I have the pleasure to have Dr. Mark Lundy. So he will be introducing himself and he will be introducing the topic that he'll be talking about. So again, thank you for the ones that are just joining us. We just a couple housekeeping things. This is being recorded so we can post it later on. There is a Q&A session that it's open, so you could ask any questions. I'll keep track of the questions you're asking. And at some point, Mark is going to be letting you know that it's time for the Q&A. So that's when we'll be doing the Q&As. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. And Mark, please take it from now.
Great. Thanks, Claudia. Claudia, you can hear me okay? And there was one chat question already, which was, I assume that participants are in listening mode only. That's correct. It's in a webinar format. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, like the question about whether it was listening only mode. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. But confirmation that you're seeing that all right?
Yep, I'm seeing that. If anybody has any issues listening or seeing anything that Mark is showing, please let me know in the chat room.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, so let's get started then. Just by way of introduction, my name is Mark Lundy. I'm an agronomist at Cooperative Extension based out of UC Davis, in the Department of Plant Sciences. And to give you a little bit of broader view of our work, we're going to be talking about nitrogen management specifically today. A little bit broader view of our work, we're trying to inform advisors and growers and people involved in the small grain industry in the state of California about agronomic management. So we do a lot of field-based research. We create information products like web tools and websites based out of the agronomic data that we collect. And some of the work that we do that we're not going to be covering as directly today is variety screening and comparing late stage varieties in development by breeders to current varieties. There's a lot of work that's been done in California in the past on pest management. And so we try to act as a resource for applied research and extension to the state of California and small grain growers in the state. So some of you probably are aware of that, but in case we have people joining who are not as familiar with cooperative extension, that's our mission. I want to start out by acknowledging some of the folks who have participated and contributed in the work that I'm going to be presenting today. And Taylor Nelson works with me at UC Davis in the Grain Cropping Systems Lab. And she has been a real great part of our team for more than 4 years now and has led a lot of agronomic research in the course of her master's degree. She's also leading a lot of our demonstration projects using nitrogen management in smaller grains and is doing a lot of web development too. So Taylor's been a really key part of my team for a number of years now, and a lot of the work that I'm presenting is work that she has contributed greatly to. In addition to that, there's a team of cooperative extension advisors throughout the state of California who are working in agronomic crops, including small grains, and they're helping with a demonstration project, and I'm going to be presenting some of the outputs from the demonstration project today. And they're Nick Clark, who's in Kings County and in San Joaquin Valley, Michelle Leinfelder Miles, located in the Stockton office covering the Delta region, Conrad Matisius, who's located in the Woodland office covering the Southern Sacramento Valley, Sarah Light, also in the Sacramento Valley out of the Yuba City office, Giuliano Galdi, who's up in Wairika and covering some of the Intermountain region, along with Tom Getz, who's in Susanville in the northeastern part of the state. So pretty broad geography that we're trying to cover. And as you'll see when I do a little overview of small grain production in California, it really is across the entire state. So in addition to the folks that I have pictured, there's been a lot of people who've contributed to this work over the last 7 or so years. And I just want to make sure that everybody recognizes that this is a team effort. Also, the support for this has been varied across the years. We're trying to pull together a lot of different research projects here and present just the key elements. But CDFA FREP, NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants, California Crop Improvement Association, California Wheat Commission, as well as my department at UC Davis, the Department of Plant Sciences, Cooperative Extension more broadly, and UCANR have all contributed to this. So what we're going to try to do is spend about 20 minutes giving some broad overview of California small grain production, why nitrogen is a focus in agronomic cropping systems, talk a little bit about concepts of nitrogen supply and demand and how to estimate those. We'll take a little break, about 5 minutes, for feedback and questions on the content at that point. And then we'll dive back in to get into some more specific management issues, including timing of availability of nitrogen and fertilizer applications, and then give you some examples of tools that we've been developing and how we're applying those tools in the real world. So broadly speaking, wheat, barley, oats, the small grains that are primarily winter grains, although in the Intermountain region, up in the northern part of the state, they tend to be both spring and fall sown. But broadly speaking, these are fall sown crops, winter crops in a cropping system that is largely a summer irrigated cropping system. So in California, oftentimes we refer to these as rotation crops. They're grown in rotation with a lot of the annuals that you see around the state: alfalfa, cotton, corn, tomatoes, and others. But you also see them in rotation with perennial crops. After a tree crop comes out, several years of a break from trees might be in annuals, including small grains. And one of the things that a lot of people understand and recognize is that they provide benefits to broader crop rotations, including breaks in disease and weed cycles. And by being in the ground in the wintertime, when California is getting most of our rain, crops increase infiltration, improve soil structure, and then also because they're in rotation with summer annuals that are irrigated and fertilized, they can also do some ecosystem services by recovering and retaining some of the nitrogen that's been left behind from the summer cropping systems. And we'll get into that a little bit as we move forward. And despite their widespread growth in California, we are seeing some decrease in overall production in recent years. Between the last 5 years compared to the 5 years before that, over the last 10 years, we've seen about a 33% reduction in overall acres, as well as a decrease in the number of acres that are grown for grain. Back in the first half of the 10 years, it was about half and half that were small grains that were grown for grain versus for forage, hay, silage, animal feed purposes. And now we're seeing not only a decrease in total acres, but also a decrease in the number of grain acres, an increase in proportions going to forage. And that's for a number of reasons that are interrelated and somewhat complicated, but the simple reasons are water availability in California is a real key driver to decision making in agricultural systems, and also wheat, barley, small grain crops tend to be relatively low priced, and they are being grown in a state that is fairly high cost and competing for ground with high value crops like trees and specialty vegetables and other crops that are able to get more money per acre and per unit cost. So you do see them in rotation pretty broadly. We are seeing a decrease in overall productivity. And this map is just showing different colors based on how frequently wheat is grown in a given location. So you see there's more concentration in terms of the number of years over the course of a 10-year period in the San Joaquin Valley, in the dairy areas for applications that are more animal feed oriented than grain oriented. So our current status right now, wheat and triticale is about 400,000 acres per year, with about a third of that for grain and the rest of it for forage. We have a decent amount of oat acreage in the state, but almost all of that's for forage. About 5% of it's for grain. Barley production in the state is around 60,000 acres, about half for grain. And then as the total acres has gone down and the price has been a little bit weak, we are getting an increase in total acres of organic production as well as an increase in proportion. So as of 2019, organic production was about 5% of the total acres and about 18% of the grain production in the state. That's an up and coming part of the market that Claudia at the California Wheat Commission and the Golden State Grains and others have been working to develop markets for. So just to give you an overview of what's normal, what's typical in California, for those of you who may not be familiar with the systems here, grain yields are on average around 5,000 pounds per acre for wheat, a little higher for triticale. Oat yields are around 2,500 pounds per acre, barley around 3,000, and organic production is around 2,500 pounds per acre. But the important thing, and I'll show you in the next slide, is that there's a really wide range of yields possible in California production systems because the state is so diverse, so vast, and the water resources and soil resources across the state really support a really wide range of production. So in some rain-fed areas on relatively water scarce ground that's a little bit upland, you might be happy getting 2,000 pounds. In some of the irrigated lowland fertile soils that are in rotation with highly productive crops, you're hoping to get 8,000 pounds or more. And so there's a really wide range of yield targets and overall expectations across the different parts of the state. And that interacts, of course, with water, like everything in California. And so this is a map of average precipitation during the fall planted small grain growing season, which is about 90% of the production. So from the beginning of October through June, over a 10-year period, the averages are in this center map. And you see what anybody from California is probably familiar with. You get a wetter environment in the Sacramento Valley, a drier environment in the San Joaquin Valley, and very dry down in the Imperial and desert regions. But anybody who's familiar with California knows that the average is somewhat a figment of our imagination. In reality, we see a lot of variability. So a really wet year can look like 13 plus inches in great parts of the San Joaquin Valley. And likewise, in a really dry year, you might be just scratching to get by with just enough rainfall to make a crop in the Sacramento Valley. So there's a really great deal of variation in rainfall. And that means that people manage their water somewhat in reaction to that rainfall. And some of the production is rain-fed, can be described as truly rain-fed because there's no irrigated potential. There are other places more as you get further into the San Joaquin Valley where it's not really possible, even in a good year, to be making a crop that's going to be irrigated. And certainly in the Imperial Valley, it's going to be irrigated the entire time. That's just part of the system. And then there's a lot, I think, of the state, in my experience, that's kind of an irrigate if I have to approach. And you can see that, from the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley all the way to the Sacramento Valley, a lot of years you're going to get by with that. Some years you won't. But I think a lot of people are approaching that as a sort of least cost approach to management, and not necessarily trying to maximize yields, but trying to maximize output per unit cost. And so since water is so key to crop growth and nitrogen availability, it's important to keep that interaction in mind as we start talking about nitrogen management in the state. Because uniquely compared to summer crops, it's being grown in direct interaction with rainfall. Okay, so why is nitrogen so important, and why do we want to focus on it so much? So let's take a real big step back and think about if any of you have ever taken a biology class, you've probably heard of amino acids. They are part of every biological organism. They're building blocks of proteins, and at the base of the amino acid chain is the nitrogen. So it's biologically essential to microorganisms, macroorganisms, plants, animals. And because it's so essential, it's pretty ubiquitous. It's the majority of our atmosphere, and it cycles through all of our ecosystems. In cropping systems, nitrogen is frequently the most limiting macronutrient, as a lot of people who are managing these systems know. After water, typically the next most limiting resource is fertility, and nitrogen is the macronutrient that plants uptake and need first and foremost. So to give you a little example of what that means in practical terms, as part of our research program, we conduct trials on varieties, like I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk. And one of the things we're interested in is knowing varieties that do well under stress conditions, as well as under fertilized conditions. So we've been growing big groups of common wheat and triticale, and seeing how they do under fertilized versus non-fertilized conditions, with everything else held constant. They're watered the same, they're managed the same otherwise. And so just taking nitrogen out of the equation is going to cost you, in our recent estimation, somewhere around 2,500 pounds per acre and 3% of protein. So that's a real big difference in what you can get for a crop and what you can do with that crop afterwards in terms of grain quality. But we know it's important, but it's also a double-edged sword. And the reason is that we can't synchronize the supply of nitrogen with plant demand perfectly. And that creates opportunities for loss. And nitrogen is being cycled through so many different elements of our ecosystem that it's always being traded between microorganisms in the soil, traded within the atmosphere, and all the interfaces of biological systems. It's very mobile, it's very transferable. And because of that, to make it available to plants that we want to grow, it's also available to other things, and therefore available to loss. And so really what we're trying to do increasingly in our cropping systems is to put as much nitrogen as possible into the food supply chain, and so that it becomes available to a consumer to eat and add nutrition to our global community. And as much as possible, we want to minimize losses to the environment where the excess nitrogen can cause problems with human health, ecosystems, and make contributions to climate change through gaseous emissions. So this is a broad, global effort that's being made. In California, we have regulations around nitrogen use that growers and advisors and land managers are having to implement. So we're trying to look at this as a way to meet those regulations while also making our systems more efficient and thereby more profitable. So how do we do that? The concept of nitrogen use efficiency is kind of fundamental to this. And what we mean by nitrogen use efficiency basically is matching crop nitrogen demand with system nitrogen supply. And the system is complex. It's got soil, it's got fertilizers that we are adding to the system, and we're trying to get those things at the end of the day, at the end of the season, to be in as close a balance as we can. And if we are out of balance, if we have a certain amount of yield that we need to get, which is represented by this horizontal line, that's the amount of yield that we need to get. And there's an amount of nitrogen associated with that yield. If we are putting a lot more nitrogen into the system, that's this horizontal axis. We're putting more nitrogen into the system than we're taking out of the system, then our efficiency is very low. And that's going to create opportunities for loss and pollution. Conversely, we can't be too efficient because we don't want to be mining the system of nitrogen. So a goal broadly in cropping systems is to have supply and demand roughly equal to each other. But in California, depending on what part of the state you're in, some of the small grains are actually grown without much crop rotation if they're on unirrigated land. But the vast majority are grown in rotation with other crops. And so we have to think about nitrogen use efficiency across the whole cropping system. So even if the wheat that we plant in the fall is technically mining nitrogen, if it's taking nitrogen that was excess from the summer crop, say it followed tomatoes and there was a lot of extra nitrate available in the soil, and the wheat can use that and help to make the whole system more on a one-to-one basis, then that's a benefit for us overall. So we're trying to make our systems that include the entire suite of crop rotations more efficient and roughly equal supply and demand. And when you have really diverse crop rotations like we have in California, the winter where all the rainfall is coming, where there was a lot of maybe residual nitrogen from all the summer cropping, is a good opportunity for small grains to make a contribution to the broader ecosystem benefits in the state. Okay, so for some of you, this might be really obvious if you're working in cropping systems and if you're tracking your nitrogen management. But I actually get this question a decent amount, and I just wanted to quickly go through how we estimate crop nitrogen demand so that everybody is aware of that. With small grains, particularly wheat and barley, that have some value attached to their protein content, typically we're measuring both yield and grain nitrogen content. So it's fairly straightforward to get a basic estimate of how much nitrogen the crop is removing from the field. Basically, you just multiply the yield by the crop nitrogen content, and that's going to give you a rough estimate of the crop nitrogen removal. So an example, for an average grain yield of 5,000 pounds per acre and an average protein content of 12%, a factor that you can convert protein to nitrogen content is 5.75. I rounded up just for simplicity here to 6. So roughly 2% nitrogen content in an average protein. And so at that yield level, you're going to be pulling off around 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the grain. But as we know, the grain doesn't exist without the rest of the plant, and the straw also has some nitrogen. Another rule of thumb, there's some variability around this, but you can use this as a rule of thumb, would be to multiply the grain nitrogen content by 1.25, and that would give you the overall above ground nitrogen content in an average small grain crop. Okay, so if you have the yield and you have the protein content, you're pretty close to having a ballpark within maybe 15% of what the nitrogen removal is by a crop. It does get a little more complicated if you are measuring biomass, if you're growing small grains for forage. Increasingly, that is being measured directly. But I wanted to point out that one of my colleagues at UC Davis and UC Cooperative Extension, Daniel Geisler, he's the nutrient management specialist across a broad range of crops, and he compiled a literature review that gives some estimates of common nitrogen concentrations for different crop crop types. And so within that, you can see the small grains have both the grain nitrogen content as well as some of the straw and silage content. So this is a good resource if you're just trying to get a ballpark for how much nitrogen your crop is using and removing. So using that resource to give an example, let's take a wheat silage crop. Let's imagine it's 20 tons per acre at 70% moisture content, and using Daniel's average of 10.5 pounds per ton, then we see that we're getting a crop nitrogen removal on that crop of about 212 pounds per acre nitrogen. Okay, so first step, understanding what are the crop needs, what are the crop demands for nitrogen. But also keeping in mind that it's not static, because I already showed you in the exact same field across 6 different crops, when there was nitrogen available versus when there wasn't extra nitrogen added, we had a really different yield and a really different protein outcome. So we got a really different nitrogen removal. So I'm trying to show you how to get a baseline, but recognize also that what you do in the season and your management actions have a big impact on what the overall demand for the crop is. We'll get a little bit more into that and how to tell in the second half of the presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about soil supply. Without getting too complicated into the nitrogen cycle, big picture, organic nitrogen, mineral nitrogen are always being cycled and recycled within the system. And regardless of whether the nitrogen was originally available as organic nitrogen or as mineral nitrogen, the plant is going to take it up as mineral nitrogen. So plant available nitrogen is going to be mineral, and the supply could be a fertilizer, which is already in mineral form, an inorganic fertilizer, or an organic fertilizer, and the organic forms then need to be transformed into a mineral form to become a plant available. That adds a little level of complication when you're managing organic systems. What are some factors that affect soil nitrogen supply with specific focus on organic nitrogen? Well, the previous crop and the associated management of that crop, whether it left behind some residual nitrogen, whether there was a lot of biomass and how that was managed with tillage and residue. Was that residue incorporated? Was there a lot of biomass that's going to tie up nitrogen while the microbes try to break down all that carbon? What's the moisture and temperature situation? Because all those things are elements that microbes need to do their business. So there's some sort of short-term seasonal effects, and then there's some broader factors that are things that you're kind of dealt with in your location. Soil organic matter can change, but it takes a long time to change over a lot of management actions over many seasons. Soil type's not going to change. So there are some factors that do affect the soil nitrogen supply that are long-term as well as short-term. But some general rules of thumb, and again, this is a complicated biological system, so I want to make sure that you understand that I'm giving you general rules of thumb, not absolutes here. But one rule of thumb, particularly, and it applies and has been validated in California soils, is that you get about 30 pounds of nitrogen that's going to mineralize per percent organic matter in your soil. So imagine that you had 1.5% organic matter over the course of a season. You might expect about 45 pounds per acre to mineralize. Another important estimate of soil nitrogen availability is nitrate, and that's plant available when you measure it, but it's also very mobile. So if a lot of water comes and moves it through the profile or helps it to get lost through denitrification, there's other loss pathways if there starts to be interactions with water and time. But if you measure it at a point in time, it's a pretty good proxy for a available fertilizer equivalent. And roughly speaking, the part per million of a nitrate soil sample is about four times that will give you the fertilizer equivalent. So you had 10 parts per million nitrate in, you'd be having about 40 pounds per acre in the top for the soil. Okay, so those are some general estimates there. This is the same data that I was referring to where we didn't fertilize or we did fertilize. And we're not going to look through every single part of this table, but basically where we didn't fertilize, the only nitrogen that was available was the soil nitrogen, the thing that we were just talking about. And on average, we were getting about 88 pounds per acre from the soil in these trials. But the range is pretty big, as little as 36 pounds per nitrogen and 124 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, so because it is a complicated system, it's not always predictable how much nitrogen is going to be available. But there are some things we can do to make the predictability better. So let's show you what one of the things we can do. I just mentioned the soil nitrate quick test, and we've built on some tools that have been available for a long time to improve our understanding of what's the nitrate concentration right now in the soil that I'm dealing with. And so this is a website on our small grains research and information center that's part of the agronomy RIC. And we've got a video that shows you how to take a soil nitrate quick test. We have some interactive step-by-step instructions that link out to the different materials that you would need. And we also have some tools for interpreting the outcomes of that test. So that's what I'm going to use right now to talk about the difference in the soil nitrate supply. But I just want you to be aware that you could go through this website and spend some time understanding key considerations, materials that you need, how to perform the test, and then get some immediate results for what the current nitrate concentration is in your soil. And I will say that in the last several years working with growers, this is something that's often overlooked, either pre-plant or in season, but particularly pre-plant. People tend to manage based on a calendar or a habit, and we've had on more than one occasion encouraged or helped somebody take a soil nitrate quick test pre-plant, and they found that they have a lot of nitrogen residual from the previous crop sitting there, and that their pre-plant fertilization might be a little bit unnecessary or excessive. So this is something that's worth checking out. I want to illustrate the difference in the two values that I showed you a second ago. So those were taken from a research station in Fresno County. And here in the trial that the soil contributed 36 pounds per acre, we took a pre-plant soil nitrate quick test, and we had 0.5 on the pad value there. And that translated to about 13 pounds per acre of nitrogen available at that moment. And then the subsequent year, where we had a lot more soil nitrogen contribution, we also took a pre-plant soil nitrate quick test and got 10 on the value, on the pad value, which was 64 pounds per acre, plus or minus about 16. So what that's telling you is, if we go back to this, we didn't explain the entire range of variability in the soil nitrogen contribution, but we did reduce that variability quite a bit. We explained it a decent amount just by taking that soil nitrate quick test. So based on that test, we would have expected this field to yield lower and have much less nitrogen available for the soil supply than this field, just based on that simple test. Okay, so just to reiterate that, crop E, based on a quick test that you can do with materials that are available online, was giving us, before the season even started, an indication that field was going to be much less fertile in terms of nitrogen in crop F. Of course, it is more complicated than that, and that's what the second part of the talk is going to focus on. When you have you subtract how much the soil supplied versus how much the plant produced, it's not consistent from year to year. And we're going to talk about reasons why in a second. But I'm going to take a break here and take an opportunity for questions on this first section, and see if anybody wants to clarify anything.
Thank you, Mark. We have one question on here, the Q&As, and this is, it says, is there any work being done on quality of yield, protein quality, nutrient density?
Yes. Okay. Buddy's team is actually doing a lot of work on quality beyond just protein concentration, and in terms of how different varieties or different components that are beyond protein are contributing to the overall grain quality. In addition to that, we've done a little bit of work on that in malting barley. It's not as linear as just a relationship between protein and quality, but protein is the main driver of quality typically. So a lot of the other components are sort of downstream of that. But yeah, that is a good question, and something to look into if you're really trying to fine tune systems. Another question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there is both nitrogen and water are limiting factors. What does the input supply interaction look like? Is one more limiting than the other?
Okay, so that is going to depend on the individual site year. Typically, on average, the water is more limiting. If you don't have enough water, then the nitrogen is not going to become available anyway. The plant is demanding a huge amount of water, so water tends to be more limiting than nitrogen. But there are occasions where there's enough water and it's really the nitrogen that's limiting, or there's too much water, and it can cause losses of nitrogen through denitrification and other means. And so that is not always the case, but typically, if you had to rank which one is more limiting. Another question here: how well does the nitrate soil test determine nitrogen contributions to the cover crop? It only will tell you what is currently available. So if the previous cover crop was recently incorporated and it's still primarily in the organic form, it's not going to catch that. So time, temperature, moisture are all required to make the nitrogen available from organic form. And so if you applied, if you worked in a cover crop and you hadn't had it sufficient time for that to break down into a mineral form, the nitrate quick test would not capture that. So then another question here: we have high nitrates in our irrigation water, 400 pounds per acre or more. Is there a way to make use of this and reduce my applied nitrogen? Absolutely, yes. So in that case, it's not a factor I dealt with here just for simplicity, but when you're making your nitrogen budget, you would want to be calculating. There's a way you can calculate that. I can follow up with you on that. That is you can say the concentration in the water by the amount of water that's being applied, and that's certainly something that could be utilized because that will be available to the crop. Okay, another question here: if the nitrogen is located in the drier horizon of my soil, can the plant access it? So if the root is not growing there, then it can't access it. So the way that nitrogen is taken up by the crop is through the roots. So if you don't have root growth, you're not going to get uptake. Nitrate is basically a mass flow movement of nitrogen. So that's going to be largely transpiration driven. So as you get in the drier horizon of your soil, there's going to be less nitrogen availability because of water limitations. This is from another question here, and then we'll probably need to move on to the second part. Is there a plan to continue to conduct small grain trials under desert conditions? I'm specifically asking at the Desert Research and Extension Center. In the short term, we are doing a trial there this season. We're planning to do a trial there this season, but that is kind of a season at a time at this point.
Okay, Mark, we can take that last one. Is annual variation in nitrogen uptake and supply the same as annual variation in weed nitrogen uptake?
So annual variation is very extreme. So I'm going to show you that in a second, actually. So it's not always consistent. I'm not exactly sure whether you're asking whether the wheat is always taking up the same amount of nitrogen regardless of the supply. The answer to that is no, if that's what you're asking. Because if there's more supply and there's more opportunity to grow, then the wheat will take up more of it. Let's get into that on the next part. Okay, so just took a break for questions. So timing, and that's kind of to that question. I want to make sure that people are aware of the different stages of crop growth. We're not going to go through them all right now, but I'm going to refer to a couple of them along the way. So tillering is that early vegetative expansion of biomass. Stem extension is still the vegetative growth stage, but you're getting a taller plant and the seed pushing through the stem. And then after the head emerges, you really transition into the reproductive growth stages. And so as that relates to nitrogen, the timing of nitrogen demand by the plant precedes the greatest expansion of biomass. So I want to give you a quick, okay, yeah, the question is, can you email the picture of the growth stages? Sure. And that'll be on the, that'll be something that we can post later on too on the website. But here's a question for you guys, and this is related to timing. The picture on the top had fertilizer applied pre-plant only. The picture on the bottom had fertilizer applied at tillering and then another bit at flowering. So it was about 80% at tillering, 20% at flowering. This picture was taken right before that tillering application. This is in tillering, and the crop on the top looked a lot better. Crop on the bottom looked a lot worse, but then got a big dose of nitrogen. And the question that I want you to ask yourself is, which of those yielded more? Answer that in your own head, and I'll tell you the answer is that this crop on the bottom yielded 16% higher and had a 1% higher protein. And that's because of timing. So like I said, you're accumulating nitrogen right before the big biomass expansion. This figure is showing at a given season, starting at the end of January, how much biomass is changing both in a fertilized and an unfertilized wheat crop. And you can see that most of it's happening late in the season, after March. Conversely, if we add nitrogen concentration in the tissues, we're getting really high concentrations in the tissues as the plant's trying to accumulate all the nitrogen and other solutes it needs to be able to fill all that biomass with protein and other productive elements. So you're getting this great increase of concentration early in the season so that you can fill the biomass later in the season. And you kind of start to see that demarcation between the vegetative and reproductive growth stages when the plant is starting to translocate what it gathered early in the season. So early in the season, it's gathering and also determining how aggressive to be in its seed set, what kind of yield is going to be reasonable for it. And so if you can introduce fertility at that time, you're both making it available when the crop needs it most, and also you're giving a signal to the plant that, hey, you just got some pretty good conditions. Maybe you should be a little bit more aggressive in your grain expansion. That's a big part of why those in-season applications matter. Okay, just to reiterate, we're getting most of our nitrogen uptake in a relatively narrow window after tilling, before boot. So that's about 50% of the total in uptake is happening in that really narrow window. So you can use this early part of the season to assess whether or not the plant has sufficient nitrogen resources, and then respond if it does not at a time that's more beneficial to the plant. I'm going to give you some examples of that in a second. this is an average rainfall distribution in the Sacramento Valley over 10 years between beginning of October, the middle of November, and the end of the small grain growing season. And you can see that you get about half of your rainfall before you have much nitrogen uptake at all. So that creates a lot of opportunities for nitrogen loss early in the season, which is another reason why that in-season application is so important. But like we said at the beginning, an average year is rarely a reality here. So this is a given year, and the darker lines are the actual rainfall in a really wet year. Rainfall by the beginning of the year was 100% or more of seasonal average. And uptake was really low, cold and wet. In a really dry year, you get a lot more uptake and you have a lot less rainfall because it's been drier, your plant's moving forward. Also, changing the date, the planting date, can change some of this too. So tracking where your crop is in terms of its phenology, in terms of its growth stages, and sending that picture out would be a good step. And I'll show you some other tools for that in a second. But on average, in-season applications are going to increase across lots of different environments. We've measured this. They're going to increase yield by about 10%. They're going to increase protein by about 0.5%. So timing is really important. So in the real world, how can we apply this? We want to shift the majority of nitrogen applications to in-season. And then we want to take some measurements. We already talked about some soil measurements. We're going to talk about some plant measurements here in a second, so that we can improve our understanding of whether the crop is currently deficient, and if so, we can do something about it. We can make some corrective actions. But if you've already held back your nitrogen so that it's available, you have more of your total budget available in season, you're both buying yourself time and information, and also you are allowing yourself to be able to measure the system and see whether the system is telling you that nitrogen is needed. Okay, so we already talked about that one. There are lots of different ways to measure crop reflectance. There's handheld devices, there's drones, there's satellites. Everybody's probably aware of these things. The principle behind all of these is that nitrogen uptake and canopy or leaf greenness are pretty well correlated, but they do saturate. So if you're deficient, you're going to be able to see a difference. But once you have sufficient concentration, you stop being able to see a difference. It's important that people understand that the numbers that come off of these machines are only relative to that field on that day and the relative greenness of that field. So one variety might be greener or less green than another on average. Drought and water interacts with greenness. So it's really only useful to take these tools as a relative reference point. And because of that, you need to be able to have some point of reference within a given field that you're trying to manage that tells you whether or not the broader crop is hungry for nitrogen or has enough. So we've been working on that a little bit by using nitrogen-rich reference zones. What are nitrogen-rich reference zones? So in a given field that you have already decided that you're going to hold back some nitrogen so that you can possibly save some for the season or hold it all back, you go and you establish a place where you know nitrogen is not going to be limiting. Basically, you put some extra fertilizer down. So in this field, we put an extra 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen as urea right before a storm. We broadcast it in these 3 locations. Doing that allows you to come back when you're trying to make a decision about whether to apply nitrogen and take a measurement, either by a handheld device, by a drone, by a satellite. And if you take that measurement and you can compare the value in the reference zone to the broader field, you can get a pretty reliable indication about whether that crop is hungry for nitrogen. And so that's what this system is based on, is called the sufficiency index. Basically, it's just the ratio of the reference zone to the broader field. And sorry, I actually reversed this. The broader field to the reference zone, it's B divided by A. It's basically, is the field less than the reference zone. Okay, so here's how you would apply that. And we have been doing this as part of this demonstration project in the real world. So this is a field in Colusa County. Average yields are around 7,000 pounds per acre. Average protein is 11.5%. Before we started working on this system, the grower was applying about 100 pounds pre-plant, and if they thought that was hungry for nitrogen based on just observing the crop visually, they might apply 30 to 50 pounds in season. And that's pretty typical for a lot of management in the Sacramento Valley. So we made a nitrogen-rich reference zone by adding some extra fertilizer there, and the grower reduced their pre-plant rate from 100 pounds to 50 pounds. Then we went out and measured, both with handheld sensors and with a drone, the field and also the reference zone that's right here. We also measured the soil nitrate. And we found that in early January, we started to see that there was a darker green in the reference zone than the broader field, which is an indication, SI value of 0.93, that the crop was likely to respond to nitrogen fertilizer. So we've created a tool to help interpret that. I'm going to share that with you right now. So we can find our location either through a pin or you could enter it. In this case, I'm going to enter it since I know what the coordinates are. And then we can enter the dates of interest. This grower planted on the 22nd of November. And you could do this in the given season. This is the field that we studied a couple of years ago. So I'm going to enter the dates for that season. But you would be able to do this in real time too. There's some other choices that you can make, but for the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and take you to this dashboard. Will give you a view of what that season is looking like, and you can compare that to the historical average for the same location. So you can see that rainfall was a little bit behind average. It was a little bit hotter and drier, and uptake was a little bit ahead of average. And based on some of the models that we've created, the stage of growth was in semi-elongation. And so you could correct that if you wanted to, but we'll just go ahead and accept that. Like I mentioned, there were measurements taken, and we found that the sufficiency index at that field was 0.93. The measurements were actually taken a little earlier in the season, so at the end of January. And then from there, we can get a prediction of how responsive the crop is likely to be based on what was the pre-plant fertilizer applied, what's the average yield of the field, the protein and yield goals, 7,000 pounds and 11.5% is the goal of this field. You get an estimate of remaining nitrogen based on some of the same principles that I presented at the beginning of the presentation. And then from there, we can get likely response graph. So in this situation, based on that nitrogen-rich strip showing up, we thought that there was going to be responsive to about 60 pounds or a little bit more of nitrogen, and it was going to add about 1,000 pounds of yield and a couple percentage of protein. So in that case, that's about what happened. She got about 500 pounds more than her average yield, increased protein by about 2%, and applied about 20 to 40 pounds less in the season than she typically would have applied. So that's kind of the goal of a demonstration project that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. This was last season. We had 6 demonstration sites, and unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to do a lot of field days. But we're hoping that we'll be able to do some more field days this season. We're having some demonstration sites again, where we're implementing these nitrogen-rich reference zones in the same way, taking measurements of the soil, taking measurements of the plant, showing our cooperators and interested parties how to do those things, and making a lot of that available on our website that I already directed you to, this nutrient management portion of the website here. And so the nitrogen reference zone work is housed right here. The soil nitrate quick test is housed here. But basically, we're compiling case studies of the different fields where we've worked and describing the situations, the agronomic situation. We've developed some blog posts that are explaining how to implement a reference zone, how to make measurements and interpret measurements using handheld devices, etc. So we're growing the set of resources that would enable California growers to manage their nitrogen more precisely. And we'd really invite you guys to take a look at these resources, reach out to us if you're interested in some of this work and learning how to do it more specifically. So with that, I'm going to stop. We're just at noon. And I didn't leave 5 minutes for questions like I had intended to. And I got a couple of questions. Is that tool available to the public? You know, it is not yet, but we will be making it available this season. So we're just fine tuning and finishing up some of the last details. But that will be available on that same website. Share the website again, as soon as it's ready. We're hoping to release that at the beginning of January. And so that, I think you'll also ask the question about the image of the stages of growth that's embedded into that tool, as you may have seen.
There's one more question here. There is a negative relationship between yellowberry and protein content in wheat. Is this linear all the way?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, there's another one. In your demonstration sites, do you have a control site to compare it to, the control being business as usual?
So in some of our sites, we do have a control. In some of them, we have not been able to do that successfully for various reasons. Some of the ways that nitrogen is applied prevents us from doing that. Yeah, we do. At about half of the sites last year, we had a control that would compare the different scenarios.
Are there any other questions anybody else has for Mark before we have to go? One more here. When do you think the Intermountain case study will be ready?
That was a spring planted field, and so I'm hoping that one will be ready by the end of this year so that people can take a look at it when they're planning for their spring crops. Another question here, do you have experience with foliar applied nitrogen? Yeah, we do have some experience with that. Actually, one of the case studies last year, the Kings County had some foliar in the mix with some humic acid. Generally speaking, I think it is not possible often to put a lot of foliar down, and I think it's under many circumstances going to be more cost effective to apply urea or a cheaper source at a higher rate with water, but that's not always possible for various reasons. But generally speaking, the foliars have an upper limit into how much nitrogen you can get into the plant.
We're running out of time. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. If anybody else has anything to ask, please put those in the Q&A. What changes are on the horizon for small grain acreage in California?
That's a good question. There have been a lot of changes already. Just a reduction in total acres has already happened. But I think there are several things that may indicate that there's a floor to that. One is that we're going to have continuing restrictions on water use in the state. as the Groundwater Management Act comes into play. And I think that while overall that's going to be negative for most cropping systems in the state and most growers in the state, it may create a window of opportunity for more winter management in certain areas if fields are going to be fallow because of lack of irrigation water. So that may be an opportunity. Also, like I mentioned at some point in the talk, Claudia and others have been really trying to grow the market for locally sourced and sustainably produced wheat. I think there is a market out there for production systems that are not only contributing food but also contributing sustainability. And so systems like what we're trying to develop can be folded into broader management systems that can be incentivized through state and federal programs. And they may add some value, as well as on the consumer end. There's an increasing interest in some of the big buyers to be able to buy and source wheat that has been produced with less pollution or in a more sustainable way. So I think that increasingly the opportunities for making money in California small grains are going to be tied to some of the methods of production as well as the actual production itself.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it. Thank you for all of you who have been part of this webinar. And if you have any questions or would like to request anything, we'll make these available hopefully soon on our YouTube channel. So if you want to reshare it or watch it again, you'll be able to do so. And then if you have any questions, if you can just email those questions to my email, which is Carter, CARTER @californiawheat.org. I will be able to answer any questions or send those to Mark. So
I'll put my email up here.
Great.
That's mely@davis.edu. So yeah, questions, follow-ups to anything that I was not able to give a very long answer to that you wanted to ask. You're welcome to get a hold of me there.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.